Yeah, hi everybody. I hope you're doing well. And tonight we're going to look at Parsha's Toldot. But first, I just want to talk in a more general sense because basically, in last week's Parsha, we read about the death of Yishmael, and in this week's Parsha, we are introduced to the nefarious twin brother of Yaakov, that is Eisav. So I just want to offer a general comment from the Vilna Gaon on the relationship of Yishmael and Esau. We also know, of course, that Esau married a number of wives, but some of his wives were the daughters of Yishmael. So there actually is a chibur, a kind of connection between Esau and Yishmael. The Vilna Gaon says the following idea, which at first glance does not make a lot of sense genealogically. We know that there are 70 nations. The UN has more, but essentially there are 70 national groups. And the Jewish people are often described as a keves bein haze'evim. We are like a lamb amidst these 70 wolves that want to destroy us in various ways. The Vilna Gaon writes in his commentary to Chumash that 35 of these nations are descended from Yishmael, and 35 of these nations are descended from Esau. And therefore the primary enemies of the Jew is always Eisav and Yishmael, and the 70 nations are 35 coming from Eisav and Yishmael. Now, as a matter of genealogy, this is simply an incorrect statement. Eisav and Yishmael both come from Abraham. We know that the 70 nations are specifically the nations that come from Cham and from Yefes. Right? There's Shem, Cham, and Yefes. So genealogically, in fact, none of the seven, in fact, Eisav and Yishmael are not even, if you make a list of the 70 nations, they're not even on that list. Look at the end of Parshat Noach. They weren't born yet. The 70 nations are the offspring of Cham and Yefes, including Greece, which comes from Yefes, and Canaan and Mitzrayim come from Cham, and other children of Shem, other than the Abrahamic line. So what does the Vilna Gaon mean when he says that the 70 nations, 50% are Eisav and 50% Yishmael? So one might suggest that he is not referring to actual genealogical descent, but he's referring to the spiritual nature of the enemies that tried to destroy the Jewish people. And if we compare the nature of Eisav and Yishmael, we see the following. Eisav represents, at least symbolically, a kind of hedonistic materialism that simply glorifies in the accomplishments of man and seeks to simply put God out of the equation. Thus, at the beginning of the Parsha, when Eisav comes back from the field hunting, and Eisav is very exhausted, and Eisav says, "I'm starving," and Yaakov is making a lentil stew, midweek cholent, and Eisav says, "Give me it to eat," and Yaakov says, "Well, I'll give it to you if you sell me your birthright, which is the right to be in charge of divine service." It's not exactly clear what that birthright is, but it seems to be connected to a zechut of avodah. Lahavdil, the Catholics used to have a tradition: the oldest son had to be a priest, and then the second son a fireman, third son a policeman. Those were the old Irish. Right. That's the fourth one. Those were the old Irish professions. So too, before Kohanim were chosen in the desert, the avodah belonged to the Bechor, and Yaakov bought it. So what does Eisav say? Esav's words are very telling. Hine anochi holech lamut. Behold, I'm going to die. V'lama zeh li bechorah. Why do I need a birthright? Now, the simple meaning is, like somebody says, "I'm starving to death." But the commentaries say there's a deeper meaning there. Eisav basically says, there is no life after death. When I die, I die. All I have is this world. And in this world, eat, drink, and be merry. For tomorrow we will die. So what do I need? Spirituality. What do I need? Avodah. I want to enjoy life in that way. So Eisav represents the notion of a hedonistic, materialistic approach to life, which focuses on essentially pleasure.
So Esau is very much associated with the Catholic Church and so forth.
Yes.
And they have a very strong idea of hell, for example, and an afterlife.
Yes. Well, it is very interesting. Obviously, things don't exist in their pure prototypes. Things get mixed and matched. Christianity itself as you know, is an amalgamation of pre-Christian pantheism, some Greek mystical religions, and Judaism. And they kind of, in fact, the man-God, as it were, is really a motif that predates Jesus. So the afterlife was kind of introduced. But again, I would point out that as Christianity has developed in the modern world, let's take, for example, very modern, like the Church of England. Just take one example. Essentially, religion is used as a rubber stamp for whatever Western civilization wants to do. So really, it's become an irrelevancy in the sense that it has no impact on the political and moral decisions that people make. Now, Eisav therefore represents the notion of getting rid of God either by explicitly non-belief or by belief that's relegated to an irrelevancy. Yishmael, the name Yishmael, God will listen, represents a different tendency. The tendency of taking God and utilizing him for immoral and corrupt purposes. Kind of a religious fanaticism that preaches hate and destruction. So when the Vilna Gaon says 35 nations come from Esau and 35 nations come from Yishmael, he is making a symbolic point that the external oppression that the Jewish people are going to experience are going to come from two directions, literally being between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, we face the nisayon of Western hedonistic culture. That is the trial of assimilation. Not an anti-Semitism that tries to kill us. I won't even call it anti-Semitism. But the other way around. Become like us. Join with us. Become our brothers. Enjoy life. And that is a machala, that is actually an illness that afflicts not only people who reject the Torah, but even people who follow the Torah, in which somebody once described the attitude of modernity, that one might look at mitzvot as 613 problems that you have to navigate around in order to do what you really want to do. So thus we'll have the Shabbos texting. People try to invent texting on Shabbat, as it were, because God forbid, listen, we only text now 24/6. I want to do it 24/7. How can I not text? There's a phenomenon among teenagers in New Jersey that's called half Shabbat and the like, whatever it would be. That means I keep everything except texting. Texting I do because that I can't control myself or whatever it is. So one nisayon is the nisayon of Eisav, which we'll look at as hedonistic materialism and secularism. The other nisayon is religious fanaticism that preaches the ethic of hate. In one case, God is ignored. In the other case, God is besmirched and degraded by being co-opted into immorality and evil. And therefore, the Vilna Gaon is suggesting, again, the 35, I don't know if it breaks down exactly that way, but he's suggesting that we're going to be buffeted through the course of our history with two types of problems. The problem that says, be like us and join us, and the other enemy says, we will destroy you. And it is very, very interesting. The Lubavitch Rebbe used to say, and he had experienced both sides of this, it was easier to be a Jew in Siberia than suburbia, because Siberia, let's say, was the galut of oppression, and suburbia is the galut of assimilation. And of course, we're approaching Hanukkah in a little bit more than a month, and Hanukkah is really the story of the enemy of assimilation, because remember, although Hanukkah was in the Reka of a war, but remember, in many, many ways, Antiochus, from a purely secular, although he was crazy, but he was a paranoid schizophrenic, and probably so, but Antiochus, from the perspective of a secular monarch, was actually remarkably tolerant in some ways. He was tolerant in the sense that if Jews were willing to assimilate to the prevailing mores, they would be given the full rights of citizenship. He was not a Hitlerian anti-Semite. See, that is the difference in Hanukkah and Purim. Haman did not care if you were religious or not religious. Haman was going to eradicate the Jewish people, exactly as Hitler. Antiochus was exactly the opposite. He didn't care if you were a Jew or not a Jew. He just didn't want you to practice Judaism. If you were willing to go along with the Hellenistic culture, that would have been totally acceptable. So Hanukkah represents the enemy of assimilation, as opposed to Purim that represents the enemy of physical extermination. In fact, the commentaries say that is why on Purim, there is a mitzvah of a physical meal, a su'udah, because on Purim, the danger we faced was a physical danger. Hanukkah, there is no mitzvah to celebrate by eating. We have, of course, sufganiyot, etc., latkes, but there is no obligation to have a su'udah. We celebrate by the spiritual exercise of light, vanquishing darkness, because Hanukkah, it turned into a war only because the Hashmonaim didn't assimilate. But Hanukkah was not intrinsically a physical threat. Hanukkah was a spiritual threat. And that's why Hanukkah is so relevant today, because at least in most of the Western world, with some exceptions, we are not facing the kind of, of course in Israel we face both, but let's say in the United States, and who knows what will happen with the new administration, the primary threat that Jews historically have faced were the threat of assimilation. Now of course, with the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, started here but spreading to the entire world, we're going to see more of the Ishmael problem as well. So we're going to have a combination of Eisav and Ishmael. So the thought I just wanted to share with you is that this idea that B'acharit Hayamim, as we approach the coming of the Mashiach, we are going to be buffeted by Eisav and Ishmael. That is the rock and the hard place of hedonistic assimilation versus co-opting the divine for evil and hateful purposes. Eisav is hedonism, Hinei Anochi Halech Lamut, V'lama Zali B'cholcha, and Yishmael is the idea of using God for nefarious purposes. Now there is a thought in Kabbalistic literature that's very hard to understand, and it is hard to understand. It's hard to explain. But the analogy I will use in introducing the idea comes from physics, which is equally hard to explain. And that is, a physicist will speak of matter and antimatter. Or a physicist will speak of something called dark matter. You know, dark matter is actually the most mysterious force in the universe. Dark matter is simply, well, actually we don't know what it is, but it must be something, because if you measure the total gravitational pull that can be detected in the universe, it is many, many, many times greater than the total mass that we've been able to detect. If you detect all the planets, all the stars, I have no idea how they know any of this, but what I read was, if you calculate the mass of all the planets, all the stars, all the galaxies, and then you measure the gravitational pull, again, it's amazing how they can even measure all these things, the gravitational pull is millions of times more powerful than the gravitational pull of all the measurable matter that exists. So scientists have posited there must be something that is matter-like with gravitational pull that cannot be perceived or measured in any way, and they give that the name dark matter. So they have no idea what it is, but it's got to be there, because otherwise we can't account for the gravitational pull. So too, I would say that just as there is something called dark matter in the universe, there is something called dark spiritual energy in the universe. And what that means is, the commentaries tell us, that those who turn to God in prayer, even if they pray to be empowered to do bad things, there is a certain power they have because they are connecting to the Almighty. It's almost a form of black magic in a sense. It's hard to understand. And therefore the Midrashim make the point, these are Midrashim much earlier than the modern times, that Yishmael is an extraordinarily dangerous enemy because they turn to God in prayer, and God listens to prayers. They observe, tzniut, they pray 5 times a day, etc. And even though terrorism is so hateful and despicable, and despised by God, that gives them a certain power that the hedonist and the materialist is not going to have. And therefore, since the power is a spiritual power, they can be vanquished only by spiritual means. The physical enemy can be vanquished by physical means, political and military strategies. The spiritual enemy. Now, again, even as a political statement, this actually makes sense because if you think about the Cold War that existed in the world between the end of World War II and the fall of the Soviet Union. So you'll recall, if you remember this, that the way a relative peace was maintained in the world was by a process called MAD. Now, MAD meant that the two great superpowers, China was not in the ascendancy then, but the U.S. and the Soviet Union, they were massively building up their nuclear arsenal. And in a sense, the concept was, MAD stands for Mutual Assured Destruction, meaning we knew that the Soviet Union wouldn't send an atom bomb to us because they knew we would send an atom bomb in return, and they didn't want to get destroyed, and if they didn't want to get destroyed, they wouldn't destroy us. And therefore, each one had a deterrent in terms of the strike capacity they would have against the other one. The acronym is very apt. So each one was building up these huge nuclear arsenals. That was called MAD, the madness, Mutual Assured Destruction. Now, those types of strategies work only when you have an enemy who doesn't want to die. When you have an enemy that considers death in the service of martyrdom to be the supreme, reward in which they'll get the virgins and everything else that they say they're going to get, then conventional deterrents don't work at all, simply because they don't care, or at least a subgroup fanatics don't care. And when you have, I live in Malot Dafna, and we're right on the Rakevet HaKala, the stop Shimon HaTzadik, right the border of East Jerusalem. And although, we go around our life, we don't have a sense of constantly walking around in fear, but at the stop, at the Rakevet, there were terrorist incidents, and there were Jewish people who were killed. And what are you going to do? All right, there's a police presence there now, but here you're talking about an Arab from across the street just turns his car and rams it into a group of people standing. What are you going to do? Are you going to take away cars, from people? So in a sense, although, forgive me for digressing, but although Baruch Hashem, the Mishtara and the IDF, the Sahel do a tremendous job in apprehending terrorists, but the truth of the matter is to vanquish this enemy by political and military means is impossible. It's impossible because conventional deterrents don't work. People are willing to die and they don't care, and they consider it to be a great thing. So, Kabbalistically, the way this would be explained is that which comes from Yishmael has a spiritual power. And spiritual powers can be defeated only by spiritual powers. By Torah, Tefillah. Of course, we still have to have Hishtadlut, B'derech HaTeva. Of course, we need a strong military, we need a good police department, etc. But ultimate nitzachon can only be achieved in a spiritual way. So I would call this, and again, it's hard to understand because it is hard for me. I can't fully explain why would God be amenable to people who want to do bad things. Why would they be empowered and emboldened? But I'm just invoking one enigma with another enigma, that it's similar to the dark spiritual energy is similar to the phenomenon of dark matter or antimatter. It just exists. It's kind of a law of spiritual nature that prayer invokes responses in different ways. The Talmud even says that the ganef, before he robs, offers a prayer to God that his efforts should be successful, and that will give him a certain measure of success. So I just wanted to share with you again. It's not directly connected to the Parsha, but since last week we read about the death of Yishmael, and this week we read about the birth of Eisav, the coming of age of Eisav, and a number of other stories involving Eisav. That is something to think about. People do raise the question that we'll get to the bracha shortly, but the idea of Yaakov is taking advantage of a very hungry person, or maybe it wasn't a matter of life and death literally, but Yaakov is basically saying, I'll give you the food if you, give me this very valuable thing. So they actually tell a story. The Hasidim like to tell a story that it doesn't really answer the question, but it makes a humorous point that is somewhat helpful in interpreting this. They say that a poor Jew went to his Rebbe. He said he needed to marry off his daughter, but he had no money at all. So the Rebbe told him, okay, listen, buy the first thing, buy something cheap, buy the first thing that you're offered, and then sell it, and, maybe you'll make some money. So the Yid doesn't know what to do. He basically doesn't have, anything to buy, etc., or anything to sell. No, I'm sorry. Sell whatever you have, and then maybe you'll make some money. Okay. So, buy. Right. So, yeah. So he goes into an inn, and there are a bunch of Jews who are sitting around drinking, and they see this religious guy come in. What's he doing, walking into a bar? And they figure they're gonna have some fun with him. He's walking into the wrong place. He doesn't know where he is. And they say, hey, Jew, how you doing, Rabbi? We're Jews too. We're members of the tribe. What are you here for? He says, well, the Rebbe told me to buy something for my daughter's wedding, so I'm here to buy something. I have, So he said, all right. So they're joking okay, I will sell you my olam haba, and all you have to give me is a penny, a kopek. So the person said, well, the Rebbe told me to buy whatever I was offered. So he says, you have to write it up in a shtar. So the person writes up, I sell to you my olam haba for 1 penny, 1 kopek. And the Yid did have a kopek. He gives the guy a kopek. He has a piece of paper that says, I own the olam haba of Avram, whatever his name was. Okay. And of course, Avram and his friends are laughing. What an idiot, so naive. He buys my olam haba. Everybody knows you can't sell olam haba. So anyway, he goes to his wife, Avram, the guy who sold his olam haba, goes to his wife and he says, I got to tell you this funny story. I was drinking with my friends, and there was this idiotic, religious Jew, this simpleton, who was told he had to buy something for his daughter's wedding. So I sold him my olam haba. I got a penny, or I got whatever I got, a ruble. And he started laughing. Then he notices after a few minutes his wife is not laughing. And he says, what's the matter? It's funny. She says, I'm not going to live with a man who doesn't have a share in the world to come. Get it back. He says, come on, it was a joke. I didn't mean it. Get it back. So he goes back, he looks for the Jew. He says, Reb Yid, I'm sorry I made fun of you. I'm sorry we had some entertainment at your expense. Listen, here's the kopek you gave me. Just give me back the paper, okay? So the person said, no. The Rebbe said to buy. The Rebbe didn't say to sell. The Rebbe said to buy the first thing I was offered. He didn't tell me to sell it. I'm sorry. So he goes back to his wife and says, listen, the guy doesn't want to give me the paper. The wife says, get that paper back. So he offers 5 rubles, 10 rubles. At some point it's really getting relatively high. He says, he keeps on going back to his wife, and his wife says, get it back. So finally, he offers a lot of money, and the Jew still says, I'm sorry, I cannot sell it until I have permission of the Rebbe. So he goes to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe asks him, how much do you need for your daughter's wedding? He says, I need this amount of money. He says, that's what you should sell it for. And he literally got back all the money he needed for his daughter's wedding. So the Avram, who had to buy his olam haba back for hundreds and hundreds of rubles, says to the Rebbe, Rebbe, I just don't know where the fairness is here. He bought it for a penny. I took a penny from him. I now have to give him hundreds and hundreds of rubles. So the Rebbe said, anybody who's willing to sell his olam haba for 1 penny, that's all it's worth. When you're willing to pay hundreds and hundreds of rubles, that means that's how much it's worth. Meaning, olam haba is how much you want to be connected to Hashem. So they say, if Eisav is willing to sell his bechorah for Nizir ad Hashem, then that's all it's worth. Yaakov didn't cheat him at all. Because Esav's olam haba, earned through the mitzvot, through the avodah, is a function of how much he cared about it. But there's another mahalach that is given by the Ketsav HaKabbalah. The Ketsav HaKabbalah, it's a wonderful, wonderful parish, a fantastic parish that is not learned that much today. It was written in the 19th century and during the height of the Reform movement in Germany. Same time as Rav Hirsch's commentary. And in fact, it's dealing with the same themes to try to show the validity of the oral law when it was under attack by the Reform movement. And he points out the following. He points out that when it says Yaakov purchased the Bechorah from Eisav, the pasuk says V'Yaakov nasan li Eisav, and Yaakov had given to Eisav. Now he points out that usually in biblical Hebrew we express a past by called the Vav HaHipuch, meaning to say, normally you would say Vayitain Yaakov li Eisav. And Vayitain, although Yitain is future, Vayitain in biblical convention reverses it to past. Now, as opposed to the Torah actually using an actual past, Yaakov Natan. So what is the difference between Vayitain Yaakov and Yaakov Natan? Both would be translated Yaakov gave. So the Ketsav HaKabbalah says Vayitain is a simple past. Natan is what grammarians call a past perfect. Now, for those who are not into grammar, what that basically means is that when the Torah is describing a sequence of actions, that Yaakov purchased the Bechorah, and he gave Eisav the Nazirat Hashem, that would imply he didn't give him the food till after he purchased the Bechorah. But if it's a past perfect, we translate, and Yaakov had already, in other words, he bought the Bechorah, and then it's telling me, and Yaakov had already given him the food, which means, grammatically speaking, if you translate Yaakov Natan, not and Yaakov gave, which is after the purchase, but rather and Yaakov had given, then the pasuk is actually making a totally opposite point. That Yaakov had given Esau the food first, and afterwards he negotiated for the sale. That's a very, very ingenious interpretation, very unusual interpretation, but it is based on the difference between Vayitain Yaakov, which is a simple past, and Yaakov Natan, which he translates Yaakov had already given a past perfect, and that might explain the difference. So according to that, he did not cheat. Although the truth of the matter is, Eisav later did say that Yaakov had cheated him, but that could just be his perception. Okay, but now I want to go forward to the bigger story, and this is a story that happened many, many, many years later, when we find that Yitzchak feels he's about to die, although he actually lives for many years longer, but Yitzchak feels that he's on his deathbed, and Yitzchak wants to give a blessing to his firstborn son, Eisav. And Rivka sees that Eisav should not be the one that gets the blessing, it should be Yaakov. And she engineers a whole deception in which Yitzchak, who thinks he's blessing Eisav, is actually blessing Yaakov. And there's kind of a magical aspect here. Like, you'd figure, somehow the one that gets the spell is going to be successful. I mean, if he gave it to the wrong guy, so it belongs to the right guy, right? But somehow, and we'll try to explain this a little bit, there's a certain magic effect. If you were the one that got those words, it's yours, even though you deceived. But we have so many questions. So the first point I want to make is really a bit of a family dynamics point. And that is, Sarah had Abraham had a problem child. Yishmael wasn't Sarah's child. And Yitzchak and Rivka have a problem child, Esau. Look at the difference between the relationship between Sarah and Abraham and the relationship between Rivka and Yitzchak. Sarah and Abraham had a great deal kind of equality. Now, when Sarah saw a problem, she directly told Abraham, this kid is creating problems. He's undermining the spiritual heritage that we need to preserve in this family. We have to do something about it. We have to send him away. And Abraham didn't want to do it, and he asks Hashem, and Hashem says, whatever Sarah says is right. There was kind of a directness in their communication. They kind of were a team in which they were equals. As Chazal say, Avram worked with the men and Sarah worked with the women. And when there was a problem, Sarah took the initiative to address the problem and deal with it. And there was no obfuscation, there was no cover-up, there was no indirection. It was a very, very direct type of relationship. One, of course, predicated on mutual respect. We mentioned last week that maybe the Akedah may have changed that at the very end. That's a speculation of Reb Steinsaltz and some others. Rivka deals with it in a very different way. Why doesn't Rivka tell Yitzchak? Eisav is not the righteous person that you might think he is. Rivka has to deal with trickery, deception. She can't really tell her husband what's bothering her. Now, on the most superficial level, it might be because of a very significant age difference, although that's relatively superficial. Remember that the age difference between Avram and Sarah was 10 years, which is not totally insignificant, but as you get older, the big age difference doesn't become that important. 80 versus 90 is not a tremendous difference. But according to Chazal, and this is the opinion Rashi follows, Rivka was only 3 years old when she married Yitzchak, who was 40 years old. So there was a big, big, big age difference between them. And in that sense, Rivka was like a child. She felt she could not necessarily talk to Yitzchak. But the Netziv gives a different reason. The Netziv says that Yitzchak in many, many ways was otherworldly. The experience of the Akedah changed him. He was more connected to the heavens than the earth. She looked at him with a sense of awe. She could not bring up the issues that perhaps a wife would normally be able to bring up with a husband. She was overwhelmed by him. In fact, the Netziv says that when she was brought to marry him and she sees him, so what she does is, remember, she took the veil and she covered her face. So people say, oh, that's Sinias, etc. The Netziv says totally different. The Netziv says she covered her face because she was afraid to even look at him. There was like kind of a godly radiance. And as a result, of course, we can also say too that Rivka herself came from a family of deceivers, Lavan and the like, and this may have been the modality which she understood, and this is the modality that she employed for good purposes, granted, but this is kind of what she learned. This was her survival strategy in life. So just on a superficial level, the family dynamics, that's why Breitowitz is a great manual for family therapists, because we have all sorts of dysfunctions and good relationships and bad relationships and sibling rivalries and kind of people working together, people working apart. There's like many, many, many different family stories in Breitowitz. Yeah.
There's also difference between both couples because Sarah only had Yitzchak.
Yeah.
While Rivka had both. Like it was easier for her, let's say, to send away Ishmael.
Well, but on the other hand, Rivka is exactly doing it even to her own son. Meaning to say, if the narrative would say Rivka didn't try to disinherit Esau, then your point would be a very good point because this is her son. But Rivka's trying to do it, but she's not doing it directly. So.
Because he's also part of the family, like Rivka.
Well, yeah, but I'm not sure. If Rivka's trying to do it anyway, so why would it be indirect in that way? Yeah.
So I like the interpretation you mentioned very much by the Kasha on it, because later Rivka tells Yitzchak very clearly, I don't like the girls that Esau.
Yes. I'm going to address that exactly. I'm going to come to that now. Everybody, I'm sorry. Question? Yeah.
Two things to bring up. One is, how come it is the power of Eretz Yisrael that brothers not get along?
Yeah.
You had with Eisav, you had with Ishmael, you had with Yaakov's kids.
That's right.
But Joseph's kids, it's more born in Galus, raised in the palace.
Yeah.
And they were so kind to each other. And the other thing that I want to bring up, I don't know if anybody else says it, is that Yaakov was just sitting and learning, but Eisav was, he would keep it out every day in and day out.
Yeah, in point of fact, I have to say,
Russ was worried that maybe, Eisav was and no double on Yaakov.
Yeah. In truth, if you just read the story of Yaakov and Esau, without any preconceptions, without bringing any external knowledge to the story, there is no question that you feel a lot of compassion for Esau. That this Esau gets cheated out of things, and he may not have been the studious Yaakov and sitting in the tents of the Torah, but okay. So he liked to do hunting, he liked to do some other things, but you feel his anguish. He comes in. He went on a mission for his father, and he comes back with the desire to serve his father, the food that his father requested. And then he says, "Father, bless me." And the father says, "What can I do? I gave your blessing to your brother." And the pasuk says, Eisav cried, a bitter cry. And Eisav said, these are very emotional words. Eisav says, "Do you only have one bracha? Isn't there anything left for me?" And Yaakov gives him something. You'll have the sword, and you'll be able to. He said militarily, it's a powerful blessing, but it's not as significant. So there's a lot of pathos here. There's a lot of pain here, and I'm going to address that. But your first point is very interesting. That somehow the Jews in Eretz Yisrael don't seem to get along. That's a very, very interesting question. But I would suggest that the specific case of Yosef was, since Yosef was a victim of hatred, he was able to communicate to his children how destructive hatred was. So the fact that his kids went along well is because Yosef was the one who suffered that victimhood, and therefore he was able to communicate.
I know what's going on with my uncle, what happened to him.
Yeah.
You hear stories of men that Ishmael would be with really bad news.
Yeah.
And Esau was real bad news.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that bring to the next generation? Also knowing who your grandparents did and whatnot?
Well, again, Yosef was a tzaddik. Yosef did forgive his brothers, and therefore he was. I'm not saying every. See, you're correct. I'm not saying every person that has suffered will automatically become a more empathetic, compassionate person. Sometimes people who suffer become embittered, and they pass it on to the next generation, as we see indeed in the Palestinians and the like. But if someone is truly a righteous person, their suffering can often give them a measure of compassion and empathy, which can translate into forgiveness. Now that apparently did happen with Yosef. I'm not saying it would happen with everybody, but potentially this suffering can be a transformative experience for people. So there's a number of...
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
We know that initially he sold his birthright. He wanted to eat, drink, and be merry.
Yep.
And the extent of it's almost curious. I never understood. I always think, why did he care at that point to get the right bracha, as it were? He gave it away. He essentially gave it away himself.
Well, I guess we have to differentiate. See, that's another interesting question. What is the difference between bechora and bracha?
Okay.
The bechora he gave away, by the way, at the age of 15, just to give you a sense of chronology. He was a 15-year-old kid. In fact, that was the day Avraham died. Right. Yaakov is cooking lentils because mourners eat lentils, and Yaakov was going to give the food to his father. And Chazal actually make the point, which is I think is a very beautiful point, that Eisav didn't become like a denier in God till the day that his grandfather died. That itself is very fascinating because we see this in life quite a lot. We have a phenomenon of kids at risk. Yeah. Kids who don't get along with their parents, they can't absorb the teachings of their parents. Friction in the house, whatever it is. But there'll often be a grandparent who has this unconditional love without the day-to-day tension. And the grandparent can make a heart-to-heart connection with a child that sometimes a parent cannot. And this seems to be exactly what happened with Eisav. Chazal make the point. Eisav did not become a Rasha till the day that his grandfather died. And as long as Avram was alive. Now again, some say, well, that was just God's blessing to Avram that he wouldn't see any of his descendants become bad. I think there's something much deeper. I think that Avram was able to see the hidden goodness in Eisav. And therefore Eisav felt connected as long as somebody saw the good in him. And after that point, it wasn't that easy. In fact, Rav Hirsch makes, again, there's so many family dynamics. Rav Hirsch says a very famous thought. It's one of the most famous passages of Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. But in the yeshiva world, they don't like to say this publicly because it's a bit of a daring statement. Yaakov and Eisav are twins. Right? They're born as twins. And it says, Yigdalu Hana'arim, the young boys were raised, and Eisav became a hunter, and Yaakov sat in the tent studying whatever Torah they studied. That's right. Rav Hirsch says, the critical mistake was, Yigdalu Hana'arim, when people have twins, they often dress them the same, teach them the same, treat them the same. Yitzchak wanted both Yaakov and Esau to be godly, religious, pious people who would spend all of their days studying divine wisdom. But that wasn't Esau's personality. Esau needed, I'm going to give some modern example, he needed to play basketball, he needed to run, he needed to be a man of action, he needed to be involved in the world. So Rav Hirsch says, Esau too had many, many good qualities. Esau too had potential. But when you try to make an Esau into a carbon copy of Yaakov, you're putting the square peg into the round hole. Not only will he not become the Yaakov you want him to be, he will not even be the Esau he could have become. And therefore, Vayigdalu Hana'arim was the great, great tragedy that started this whole path. Now, this is a phenomenally important idea. Now, again, some people say, well, who gives you the right to talk about deficiencies in the parenting styles? Okay, that may be so. Whenever we psychoanalyze the avos and the imos, we always run the risk that who are we to make any judgment? But no matter what, the point is 1,000,000% valid, and that is, this is simply a reiteration of Shlomo HaMelech's famous pasuk in Mishlei, Chanoch Lanar al pi darko. A child must be trained according to their way. Everyone has unique talents. When you try to create an educational system or a family structure of one size fit all, by pitching it at a certain definition of what is shlemut, then you're setting up many, many kids to failure, to frustration, and perhaps even going off the derech of rejecting Torah and Yiddishkeit legabre. And Rav Hirsch points out that this may have been the issue of Vayigdalu Hana'arim. Now, based on this, Rav Hirsch and the Malbim explain the whole story here of the bracha later. Now, that was when they were children. The Bechorah was 15 when Avram died. And as I indicated, maybe Avram, I was suggesting, may have been attuned to Esav's personality needs in a way that Yitzchak and Rivka were not. And of course, keep in mind that, maybe there was always this comparison to his brother Yaakov. We don't know. Why can't you be like your brother? We don't know. Again, we don't know. But Rav Hirsch is suggesting that some of that was going around. So Eisav developed his own life. Even so, Chazal say, in spite of it all, Eisav was meticulous in honoring his parents. He was meticulous. That was his mitzvah. I've sometimes seen that in the world as well. It's this interesting thing that sometimes you have a kid who goes off the derech, but they make a point of still trying to show respect to them. You see, very often you see the opposite too, but I've seen examples of rebellious children who are still ochez in the mitzvah of showing respect to their parents. It's an interesting thing. That's why they hold on to it, but that's exactly what Eisav did. Because, again, I see I'm going off into the thin ice of over psychoanalysis here, but in a way, a child that is not doing what his parents dream that he should do, feel he may not be loved. My parents can't love me because I'm not living the life they want. And kibbud aviyim might be the desperate attempt to get that love from the parent that you feel you can't have. I'm not saying they didn't have it, but he feels he can't have because he's not living the life. He's not the person they wanted him to be. And that's why kibbud aviyim might be that desperate cry, love me, care about me. And that's why it's so poignant when Eisav, now the story of Yaakov and Eisav is when they're 63 years old. The Bechorah is 15. Again, there's a whole cheshbon in Rashi, but 63 years old. And Eisav is crying to his father, is there not something left over for me? How that pain of the childhood is still there. Now, Yitzchak did want to bless Eisav. Now the question is, why did Yitzchak want to give Eisav the blessing? So listen to what the Malbim says. The blessing that Yitzchak gave to Yaakov when he thought he was Eisav was actually not the same type of blessing he gave to Yaakov later when he knew he was Yaakov. The blessing that he gave to Yaakov that he wanted to give to Eisav was a blessing that was primarily material. Vayitein lecha Elokim, may God give you mital hashamayim, from the dew, mishmanei haaretz, the produce of the land, rov dagan v'sirosh, an abundance of grain and wine. Yavducha amim, nations shall serve you. V'yishtachavu lecha le'umim, nations will bow down to you. Have a gevir li'achecha, you will be a gevir, you will be the master of your brethren. This is really a bracha about land and prosperity and rulership. Now, later, when Yaakov is about to leave, but to find a wife and to escape Eisav. Remember, there's a double agenda here. Rivka wants to get him out of there to save his life from Eisav. Yitzchak says, you got to find a wife. So Yitzchak gives him the blessing, may God continue the covenant of Abraham with you and your children. So this is what Rav Hirsch and the Malbim suggest. The spiritual heritage of Am Yisrael, Yitzchak always intended to give to Yaakov. And Yaakov would have gotten that without any type of deception. That was Yaakov's blessing. But Yitzchak envisioned what later became known as a Yisachar and Zevulun partnership. Of course, that was much later. What is the Yisachar-Zevulun partnership? Yisachar was a tribe that was devoted to full-time Torah learning. Zevulun was engaged in commerce, business, and trade. And Zevulun financially supported Yisachar. And that was good for both because that enabled Yisachar to learn Torah full-time without economic worry. And Zevulun has a chelik, has a portion in all of the accomplishments of Yisachar. So here, Yitzchak is thinking towards the end of his life, although Yitzchak will live many more years, but he thinks it's the end of his life. It's kind of a rectification for the mistake that he made when the kids were young. When the kids were young, I wanted to make Eisav a Talmid Chacham too. I put him in the Beit HaMedrash. I said, you got to sit and learn 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, 14 hours, whatever hours a day it was. But I see that didn't work. Eisav was a man of action. Eisav was a person who needed to be out there playing basketball, hunting, whatever it would be. And I see that because of what I did, Rivka and I did, Eisav did not become the person he could have become. I want to rectify it. I want to teach Eisav that with your physicality, with your materialism, with your activity, you can use it in positive and constructive channels. You will be the one who will manage Eretz Yisrael. You will be the one who creates the government. You will create the infrastructure. You will create the industry. You will create the politics. That's the bad one. And in that way, Yaakov will be freed from all of the distractions. And you will get your spiritual redemption, not by negating your abilities, but by using your abilities. And the verse says that's why the bracha is preceded by hunting. Yitzchak says, go and hunt, and use the hunt for kibbud aviyim. Right, Esau was such a skilled hunter, he could actually shecht a bird in flight. He was able to shoot the arrow right through the place where you shecht. Kosher shechita, right? He was able to shoot a bird in a kosher way that shechted the bird properly, and the like. So you see what's going on. Yitzchak didn't think Esau was the more righteous person. He knew Esau was not the more righteous person, and the proof, by the way, is the fact that right before this whole event, Esau marries Yishmael's daughter, and it says it was bitter in Yitzchak and Rivka's eyes. By the way, that's another Rachmanis. You know, I want to tell you, you got to feel sorry for Esau, because listen to what happened. You know, Esau marries first a Canaanite woman. But then Chiti, one of the Canaanite nations. But then he hears that Yitzchak and Rivka don't want them to marry Canaanite women, just like Yitzchak could marry Canaanite women. So Eisav realizes, oh gee, I did something wrong. I want to fix it. So he marries Yishmael's daughter. I mean, he just makes, he makes mistake after mistake. He messes up again. So he's not a young man anymore. Approaching retirement, 65, retirement, Gamloit. So what Yitzchak is trying to do is, Yitzchak, that's the Malbim and Rapersh's point. Yitzchak doesn't think Eisav is a tzaddik, but he thinks if I give Eisav the bracha of Olam Hazeh, he will use it to help Yaakov in a Yisachar Zavulun collaboration, and then he will get his Olam Haba. So that's the strategy. The bracha of the spiritual leadership was always going to go to Yaakov. That's the point. So, what's wrong with the cheshbon? What is Rivka's point? Rivka's point is a tragic point. This may have worked 50 years ago. It's not going to work now. Too little, too late. And therefore Yaakov has to get the physical blessing as well, which is Eretz Yisrael, because Esau was not going to use his material control for the benefit of Torah. And Rav Hirsch even makes the point, a very subtle point, that Yaakov had to do it through deception for the following reason. Again, it's very intriguing. Part of Yitzchak's concern was, I don't want Yaakov to be involved. Number one is for Esav's benefit, give Esav the chance to use his talents. But number two, Yaakov will be destroyed by the politics of the world. Because Yaakov is naive, like Yitzchak was actually. Yaakov is spiritual, Yaakov is holy. And therefore the world will eat him up. He needs an Eisav to be his enforcer. So what Yaakov has to show, I know how to cheat too. And by showing I know how to cheat, he's communicating the message. Because I know how the game is played, I will not be victimized. That's part of it. So in other words, Yitzchak was afraid, Yitzchak wanted Eisav to earn his Olam Haba, and Yitzchak didn't want Yaakov to be eaten up by international intrigue, war, and politics. Rivka realizes that Eisav is not going to change for the better, and she needs Yitzchak to understand that Yaakov is capable of comprehending fraud and deceit, and that is what Yitzchak realizes when he realizes that Eisav, that Yaakov gained the bracha by deception. Now, one other point though, the Medrash makes a very, very amazing point. And the amazing point the Medrash makes is, it's not entirely clear that Yaakov emerged the winner of this particular contest. Because, in point of fact, the Medrash tells us that because Yaakov engaged in deception, Yaakov suffered the deception of Mechiras Yosef. Because Yaakov caused Esau, I didn't hear.
Rachel,
That's right.
she was wasn't given to him. Leah was.
That's right. That's yeah. You're correct. Even before then, that's correct. That's correct. The first deception was Rachel and Leah. The next deception, Mechirat Yosef.
There's also the deception of working 7 years for one wife and...
Yes, that's the Rachel and Leah, meaning he wanted Rachel and he worked 7 years and then he gets Leah and then he has to work another 7 years.
No, I'm talking about the switch off at the wedding itself. He was deceived that...
Yeah, that's what yeah. Right, that's correct.
She said, listen, let me switch.
Right.
And then Rachel was under the bed.
So, yes.
The chickens come home to roost.
Yes, so this is a crucial point. It's not that Yaakov was wrong. There may have been shikulim that justified the behavior, but if the means are morally tainted, there will be a moral consequence. Even when, as Rav Chaim Shulevitz used to say, that the mashal would be the following. Let's say, God forbid, a baby falls into a fire, and you dive into the fire to retrieve the baby. You did a great thing, a wonderful thing, a good thing, the right thing. But the fact that you did the right thing does not mean you're not going to be burnt. Being burnt is an inevitable consequence, short of an open miracle. There's going to be a natural consequence that when you play with fire, you get burnt. Chaim Shulevitz said, when you engage in fraud, deceit, cheating, inflicting pain on others, even if in the calculus of considerations, that was regrettably the best thing to do, that doesn't mean there are not going to be consequences. And Chazal, besides the fact that Yosef suffered both from the switch of Rachel and Leah and Mechiras Yosef, I should also point out that for thousands and thousands of years, the Jewish people did not have control of Eretz Yisrael. And even today, we're Baruch Hashem, we have a Medina, but we're still in a precarious, dangerous state, both in Eretz Yisrael and throughout the world. So if we ask ourselves, what bracha did Yaakov get exactly? Remember, God will give you prosperity. Yavducha amim, nations will serve you. Well, what nations are that? Yishtachavu lecha leumim, nations will bow down to you. What nations are that? Havi gevir liachecha, you will be a master over your brothers. Now, this is not the spiritual. It hasn't happened. It's a funny thing. Maybe Yaakov didn't get the bracha. The Medrash says, Yemot HaMashiach, etc. Now, Chazal make one point, one very beautiful point. When Eisav says, Vayizak zakag dalau mara, Eisav had a loud and bitter cry. Chazal, even before a machshav, even before a computer, they always knew when a similar expression appears in Tanakh. That same expression, Vayizak zaka gedola umara, appears one place in Tanakh, Megillat Esther. And that is When Mordechai hears that Haman made a gezerah to wipe out the Jews, Vayizak za'aka gedola umara, the Gemara in Megillah says, because Yaakov caused Esau to have a zaka gedola umara, the descendant of Esau, Haman is from Amalek, Amalek is from Esau, causes that midah keneged midah. So this is something to think about. People debate, do the ends justify the means? Do the ends not justify the means? But here we're adding a certain subtlety to the mix. Even when the ends may justify the means, there is a certain taint, there's a certain pagam that comes back to haunt you. The chickens come back to roost, whatever the expression you want to use. Because when you're a mishtamesh with the means of lying, cheating, causing pain to others, it will come back. There will be a consequence. And therefore, one should be very, very careful before. Sometimes you have to do these things. Just like sometimes you dive in to save the baby, you do it. But one shouldn't just say, oh, I'm doing it l'shem shamayim, so I have an insurance policy. Everything will be good. It doesn't work that way. You hurt people, there's going to be some reciprocal counteraction that's going to come back. This is kind of the complex lesson. People say like this, that people debate, how do we know the Torah is from God? Maybe it's man-made. The best answer to that is that if the Torah would have been a man-made document written by a Jew to give the history of the Jewish people, most of these stories would never have been recorded. Who's going to write their history? With Yaakov cheating Eisav twice and the like. It must have come from God, because all of the warts and all of the negatives that are there, right? So, what person would write the history of his nation with all of these negative stories? But the issue of these stories,
with integrity.
huh?
A person with integrity.
Yeah, but no ancient historian had any integrity. This was well known. I mean, all the Greek stories. I mean, every nation wrote its history with only the positives and the like. So, but the point of these stories is that they are not one-sided. It's not a question of positive, negative. There is ambiguity. There is complexity. On one hand, Yaakov was right, and on the other hand, Yaakov was wrong. On one hand, he had to do what he had to do. On the other hand, he suffers because of it. Because this is what life is about. Life is not always about a black and white decision. It's about doing the best that you can, but knowing that there are going to be some negative consequences no matter what you do. And that's actually the story of Yaakov and Eisav. And the struggle of Yitzchak and Rivka, in which they initially wanted to make, it's a tragic story, they wanted to make Eisav into a righteous person, and how much Eisav suffered from never quite being good enough in terms of the son that they wanted, and how many, many years later, when Eisav is already an older man, Yitzchak wants to fix it. But Rivka says it's not going to work. And there's a lot of sadness on all sides here. Yeah.
Does anybody connect between the selling of the birthright because Esau was starving?
Yeah.
And then fast forwarding 3 years
To the bracha.
Haman, who was starving,
Oh.
and he's running out of rations.
Ah.
So Mordechai rolls up his leg and he's trying to starve. And now Haman wants to wipe out these Jews who he owes his life to.
That's a very interesting comparison. I'll check. I'm not aware of it, but if there's a comparison to be made, it must be made somewhere. So
What's the comparison?
He's saying that Mordechai had fed Haman when Haman was still starving. Yeah, and then Haman sold himself as a slave to Mordechai. Right, so there was a transaction there too, where Haman had sold his own freedom to Mordechai, and Mordechai then reminded him later that you're my slave, technically. Okay. Anyway, have a good. One more. Okay. Yeah.
Why was Eisav starving? He just came back from hunting.
Well, he didn't eat. In other words, he was hunting. and I've never gone hunting, so I don't know, but I imagine if you're running or after animals and the like, you're going to be tired. It's physically very tired. And maybe he didn't want to eat while he was hunting because he thought maybe that would slow his reflexes a little bit. So the concept was, right, you eat afterwards. Okay. All right, have a good Shabbat.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Shabbat shalom, everybody. Can I just get everyone's attention real quick? I mentioned this earlier during the break that this Thursday we have a singles event for 55 years and up.
Yeah,
If you know anybody, everybody knows somebody. So especially looking for guys. We have a little bit of a shortage. So just so you keep in mind, it's number one. Number two, Bina and I are actually contemplating what we're going to do after Hanukkah. Meaning, should we continue to serve dinner? It doesn't look like that many, we had about half you guys come to dinner. It's a lot of work. Or maybe just have one of the two speakers, or both of the speakers, or do it in a different location. I don't know, if anybody has any input, that'll be helpful. But I'll tell you what would be even more helpful.
Right.
If you all bring somebody next week who wasn't here before, and that would be like the answer. We'd probably just continue doing what we're doing, and it would be like,
Very true.
so we'd like your help, your assistance.
He didn't understand that.
Guys, bring somebody who hasn't been here before. Really,
as usual,
energizing.
There's two very good questions. One, it's a two-part. They say she was 3 years old.
Yeah.
I have a theory about this. Maybe she wasn't literally 3 years old, but if she grew up in this house of idolatry and whatnot, maybe she was a little kid, maybe she did tshuva, and it's 3 years beyond, so she had been born, not so much but 3 years beyond
that is very interesting. I want to hear your other part, but I'll tell you a little story that ties into that perfectly.
Okay, you want the other half?
I'll tell you the story first. Of Shlomo Wolbe, Rabbi Wolbe was a great Baal Musar. When he came to the Mir Yeshiva in Europe, a man with a big beard came to him and said, "How old do you think I am?" And Rabbi Wolbe said, "Well, you look like you're 35." He said, "No, I am 3 years old because I met the great Rabbi Rucham 3 years ago, and that was the beginning of my life."
Right,
So,
exactly.
So it's exactly your thought.
Okay, that was it. And the other one part of it was perhaps she was